Venezuela drew a forceful new response today from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at the United Nations. He called Venezuela under Maduro an illegitimate mafia state and urged other countries to back the man designated to take Maduro's place. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo today putting the world on notice.
Now it's time for every other nation to pick a side. No more delays, no more games.
Pompeo urging action at a tense UN Security Council meeting to address the unfolding political and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela.
Either you stand with the forces of freedom or you're in league with Maduro and his mayhem.
Those forces Pompeo spoke of, led by 35-year-old opposition leader Juan Guaidó, who this week was named interim president by the Venezuelan parliament, drawing criticism from President Nicolás Maduro, calling it an American-orchestrated coup. Maduro tweeting, "No one is going to subdue us. We will never surrender." The split has plunged Venezuela further into crisis. Maduro, handpicked by former President Hugo Chavez, is largely blamed for the country's economic decline, with annual inflation rates up to 1.3 million%, according to a study by the opposition-controlled National Assembly. Maduro has support only from a handful of countries, including Russia and China. More than a dozen nations are behind Guaidó. After the U.S. announced its support, Maduro lashed out, expelling American diplomats from the country.
Do not test the United States on our resolve to protect our own people.
The Trump administration maintaining a hard line. Hands off Venezuela! As protesters in the U.S. pick sides.
We also today call on the Venezuelan military and security forces to accept the peaceful, democratic, and constitutional transfer of power. I call on all responsible nations to recognize interim President Guaidó immediately. Maduro has made clear he will not recognize Guaidó or call for new elections. Now is the time to stand for democracy and prosperity in Venezuela.
Ambassador Bolton, if I could, you mentioned the word significant response. How do you define significant response?
Well, we're not going to define it because we want the Venezuelan security forces to know how strongly we think that President Guaidó, the National Assembly, the opposition, and most importantly, American personnel are not harmed. This is an unequivocal statement on our part.
Is there any circumstance under which American forces would get involved?
Look, the President has made it very clear on this matter that all options are on the table.
A highly unusual weekend session. And at the outset, Russia made very clear its opposition to the proceeding, arguing that any UN involvement in Venezuela constituted a violation of that country's sovereignty.
We don't see any external threats coming from what is taking place in Venezuela. Venezuela does not represent a threat to peace and security. If anything does represent a threat to peace, it is the shameless and aggressive actions of the United States and their allies aimed at the ouster of the legitimately elected president of Venezuela.
Russia demanded a procedural vote to continue. The requisite 9 members voted to do so, but the 4 votes against a signal that yet again the Security Council would not be speaking with a unified voice.
Now it's time for every other nation to pick a side. No more delays, no more games. Either you stand with the forces of freedom or you're in league with Maduro and his mayhem.
That's a sentiment echoed by U.S. allies, the United Kingdom making a clear ultimatum.
We believe that Juan Guaidó is the right man to take Venezuela forward, and we will recognize him as constitutional interim president if new elections are not announced within 8 days.
The Venezuelan foreign minister was allowed to put his country's point of view and seized the opportunity for a show and tell of what he called illegitimate U.S. intervention in Latin America.
The United States is withdrawing forces from Syria. Well, they are going to try to start a new war now in Latin America, Venezuela. We're not going to give them that satisfaction. Peace, stability, and understanding will prevail in Venezuela, in spite of all the efforts of the countries present here who are trying to trigger a war.
The U.S. Secretary of State was not there to listen, holding a brief news conference before walking away and leaving the council, still in session, behind.
Watching the Venezuela developments, it seemed like we have returned to the Cold War with Russia. Vladimir Putin has a huge investment in Nicolás Maduro, the socialist dictator. He's lent him $10 billion. He's propped up Venezuela's failing oil company, and several news outlets, including the Miami Herald, report Russian military contractors, that means mercenaries, have been flown into Caracas in recent days. Cold War? Could be a hot war. John Bolton's notepad revealed the words 5,000 troops to Colombia at his press briefing yesterday. Colombia is Venezuela's neighbor. America has taken Maduro's money away. What he earns from those sit-go stations will be funneled to a neutral account. No money, no food, no electricity. That's a collapse. Who will the generals go with, Putin or Trump? It's back to the 80s, America versus Russia. One last point, if I may. Remember President Obama's outreach to Cuba's Castro regime? We opened up to communists, gave them a diplomatic and financial helping hand. And now, Cuban military people are a big part of Maduro's security, propping up a bankrupt, collapsing dictatorship. That's another Obama policy that I'm pleased to say failed.
They've come from all over Venezuela, across the border into Cúcuta, Colombia, some months ago, others just yesterday, and they're all hungry. So when they get the signal, they line up for the only plate of food most will eat today. The old and the ill go first, then the rest, each getting a rosary as they enter this Catholic church parish for lunch. Today it's rice with chicken and manioc. Many have no mobile phones or access to television, but they've heard the news about what is happening back home, like Barbara Figueroa.
I have faith that the situation will improve. With the new president, we can have hope again that Venezuela will be the country it was before, when we could work and feed our children.
But these two brothers who arrived 2 weeks ago with just what they could carry don't expect anything to change, despite unprecedented U.S.-led efforts to force President Nicolás Maduro out.
Our people are unarmed and will never be able to throw out a government that's armed to the teeth and protected by the military. If we had weapons, if we were the terrorists that Maduro says we are, he wouldn't be in the palace still.
While these Venezuelans line up for a plate of food, across the border in San Cristobal, as in other towns and cities inside Venezuela, people are holding open-air meetings to discuss the self-proclaimed president's offer of amnesty to members of the military who turn against President Maduro. The idea is to take away his main source of support by promising officers who have command of troops that they will not suffer reprisals under a new government. The first to publicly accept the offer was Venezuela's military attaché in Washington, who announced he was recognizing Juan Guaidó as president.
Comrade officers, captains, colonels with troops under their command, don't forget that we cannot and should not attack our people. We owe ourselves to them.
Whether others will follow is uncertain, as more and more Venezuelans arrive in Cúcuta. Some too late. The soup kitchen is closed and won't open until Monday, so they might have to go hungry for another 38 hours.
Venezuela does not represent a threat to peace and security. If anything does represent a threat to peace, it is the shameless and aggressive actions of the United States and their allies aimed at the ouster of the legitimately elected president of Venezuela.
1 Thessalonians 5:3. While people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. So how does peace and security lead to sudden destruction? And what is the sudden destruction? Is it the rapture of the church? Is it the revealing of the Antichrist? Is it war? While we can conjecture what the sudden destruction is, the Apostle Paul tells us Christians are not part of it. The Apostle Paul says this in 1 Thessalonians 4:15.